because we're closely coordinating our actions with Europe, the sanctions we're announcing today will have an even bigger bite. Now, Russia's actions in Ukraine and the sanctions that we've already imposed have made a weak Russian economy even weaker. Foreign investors already are increasingly staying away. Even before our actions today, nearly $100 billion in capital was expected to flee Russia. Russia's energy, financial, and defense sectors are feeling the pain.
What is lost in the discussion about Russia, Vladimir Putin, and what to do with perhaps the most cunning madman on the planet? In a field in the Ukraine, there are still bodies of those who fell from the sky. Their plane dismembered, allegedly by a Russian missile fired by one who received his authority from said madman, one way or another. The world and families have received no apology from him, no thought of remorse from his country, and the bear still challenges the world to do anything to stop them. President Obama went public this week with his newest round of sanctions against Russia and Vladimir Putin. But again, the question persists. Did he really do anything of substance? That and much more from corners of the intelligence globe as we welcome back to MidPoint Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. Lieutenant Colonel, thanks for being here. Good to see you again.
Thanks for being on. Thanks for having me on, Ed. It's good to be on.
I hear the phrase Cold War being tossed about, and actually when the president was addressing the media there, you heard a question from one member of the media corps said, are we in another Cold War? There's a part of me that knee-jerks and says, wait a minute, that's way too far. This is not anything close. Like is it?
Whether the president likes it or not, we are. And the president, to be totally blunt, did not sound like a man who was convinced of his own words yesterday. It was a very weak statement. It was more like he was breaking up with a girlfriend than trying to lay out to a thug what the intended consequences will be for continued bad actions. And you opened talking about the quote-unquote the president talked about the bite it would take out of Russia. This is taking a bite out of Europe. And everything we're talking about here does indicate that we are heading back towards a Cold War. Nothing has been done to deter Vladimir Putin from his agenda. Let's face it, he retook Georgia through military action several years ago. He's been gobbling up elements of both the economic landscape in Europe by increasing the influence there, as well as now Crimea. So there's nothing in so far that we've done that will do anything to deter him in one iota.
All right, here's a statement now from the European Union after these were announced. I'm going to read this for folks so they'll be able to see it, you'll be able to hear it. It is meant as a strong warning. Illegal annexation of territory and deliberate destabilization of a neighboring sovereign country cannot be accepted in 21st century Europe, quote unquote. But wait a minute now. Haven't we gotten to a point where this possibly could have been stopped earlier, where if Europe would have done, and as I like to say, put the big boy pants on a lot earlier and maybe understood that they were going to take some hits on this, whether it's economically, goods, whatever, that this could have been stopped before it got to this point had Europe not acted?
Oh, absolutely. 2 points Europe could have done on its own. First is England has great control over the Russian economy. Many of the oligarchs and other elements of the Russian economy actually bank in England. England by itself could have done a lot to prevent further annexation. Secondly, Europeans should have been a lot more aware of what's going on, again, like Georgia a few years ago. There's been no doubt, Ed, that Putin's intention is to continue to gobble up elements of what used to be the Soviet Union and try to gain the prestige and influence back that the old Soviet Empire had over at least Eastern Europe. In this case, I think they're going for Western Europe as well.
Are we at the point right now where we might want to consider a military response here? And I'm not talking about bombs, we're not talking about drones here, but at least a show of force, number one. And number two, is there enough willpower behind our European allies and those there on the ground with him to create that sort of a response?
Absolutely. I've been talking to one of my mentors, a former advisor to President Reagan on this. So we talked about it last evening, and there are 3 things we could do immediately without going face to face or head on into the Russian issue with power, but show that we are determined. First off, what I would have done is sent the 6th Fleet into the Black Sea as soon as he annexed Crimea, just to make a statement. Secondly, one of the things we should do, and I think would help our European partners, is do something called a reforger, return of forces to Europe. This was an annual to biannual exercise that we used to do back in the 70s and 80s, which basically was us returning with mass forces to Europe. We would move a bunch of stuff from the United States into staging areas in Europe, and then we would exercise in war games. I participated in these back in the 80s. This again would show resolve and show that we're still there for our European allies. And again, I would like to believe it would help prompt NATO, which is my third point. NATO has been disabused of any idea of actually having to plan for and conduct military activity. All their nations that they belong to really do not like military planning. That's fine. But in this case, they need to show resolve. They need to come back together as NATO and show, especially those new members of NATO, that we plan to support them. And one other thing I might add, Ed, I forgot to mention, is the missile defense issues. We unilaterally decided to not put missile defense capacity into Poland. I would start that back up. I would put it in there and make it a point to the Russians that we're not trying to essentially face off with you. Missile defense is an interest of everybody, especially with regard to the growing threat of the Iranian nuclear program, which would include missiles that could be used for delivery of nuclear systems.
When you talk about having some sort of exercise, though, is this not just flexing muscle at one point, Lieutenant Colonel? Because in this day and age, nobody wants to be the first one to pull the trigger anywhere. And doesn't Vladimir Putin simply sit back in his chair going, they're not going to fire, we're not going to have missiles flying at us right now. This is just America and the Europeans just showing us what they got. Isn't it fair to say that that's what he would sit back and think? And he might be right.
He might be right, but he will for sure be right if we do nothing. This is where it requires a sea change in the thinking of both political leadership at the White House as well as political leadership in Congress. No secret, Ed, the recommendations we just talked about, we're dealing with members of Congress on. And it's not simply about the president here. It's about the nation. When President Reagan put together his rhetoric against this old Soviet Union, he had done a good job of convincing the Democrats that what he was doing was actually going to be a benefit to our nation. And ultimately, he was able to use essentially the show of strength to defeat the Soviet Union without ever having to fire a shot. I think we need to understand that that's how we actually defeated the Soviet Union. And frankly, Ed, unless we do something, that nothing is going to deter Putin from continuing his march towards dominance of at least Europe and possibly even further once that's completed.
All right, now I'm going to show another quote here. This is from the Brookings Institute, and this was from Can Sanctions Stop Putin? This is Clifford Gaddy and Barry Ickles, who are Brookings analysts, with these quotes. For that, and they're talking about the sanctions. For that, sanctions would have to reduce Russia to its condition of the 1990s, when it was simply too weak and dependent on the West to oppose the international order created by the West after the Cold War.
Right.
It is clear to us that no feasible actions by the West today can recreate the weak and compliant Russia of the 1990s. So haven't they simply just gotten too strong? And maybe if we try to make a correlation here, maybe China's right, some people would say, that just by punishing Russia like this, you're destroying an entire global economy here, and you're basically just biting yourself in the nose.
The first thing that happened yesterday, Ed, after the imposition of these new sanctions was our own stock market dropped. And I would argue again that we're going to be doing as much damage to Europe and European economy, the European economy, as we are the Russians by doing what they're planning. Because two things are going to happen. First off, the Russians are going to plan around these sanctions. Secondly, a lot of these sanctions have loopholes to include, Ed, believe it or not, the largest Russian bank is not even touched by these sanctions. So it's a very weak signal. Frankly, we need to look at what would actually do something to the Russians, both at the governance level as well as the political level. Right now, again, nothing is happening.
Then what's that answer, Tony?
Well, the three things. We've got to do an adequate military show of force. We've got to say we've not departed the battlefield. Secondly, we've got to build sanctions which actually do something only to the Russians. Right now, this is completely feckless. The president's plan, what's happening is completely feckless. We've got to get something going that actually affects the Russians, not our European allies, not us. And third, and most importantly, we have to come up with a plan. If we oppose this, what do we want to see happen instead of it, and become an actor? Right now, we're passive. We are reacting to their actions. Not a good place to be. During the Cold War, Ed, we were on the offensive, not literally with military force, but concepts. We got to get back on the offensive with concepts.
I got about a minute left here. What other tactical sites, in your opinion, does Russia have its eyes on?
Well, the three that I know for a fact are the ones that they lost during the Cold War regarding the Latvia, those areas which the Balkan, the states which they lost as part of the NATO absorption of these states. Basically, there's a half a dozen states which have joined NATO. I don't have them listed in front of me, but that's one of the things I'm sure he wants back. Then beyond that, what he's already done is he's trying to actually increase the influence over states which were essentially never Soviet per se, but he wants to have dominion of regarding the economic conditions of Europe. So this is where Germany, for example, is greatly dependent on Gazprom now, one of the big Soviet conglomerates. So this is where we've got to look at what they're trying to achieve, what the Russians are trying to achieve, and go about working with our allies. Heck, we may want to come up with a Lend-Lease plan regarding energy, like we did during the build-up to World War II. Something where we can actually help our allies and thwart the plans of Putin. Again, Ed, right now, there's no plans to do any of this. Putin has a straight shot to do what he wants to do. And until we come up with alternate plans trying to get ahead of him, we're going to continue to see Putin play his game.
Always a pleasure. Always a lot of good information. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, thanks for joining us, my friend. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
All right, later on this hour, Lake Los Angeles. That and a whole lot more when MidPoint continues.